"Make me your wife, not your slave," begged the chained Apache girl to her new master. The hot sun beat down on the dry lands of the American Southwest, painting the desert in shades of gold and brown. Among the tall sagebrush and rugged cliffs, the Apache people moved quietly, their eyes always alert for danger. The young girl, no more than 14, ran alongside her family, her small feet kicking up dust as they tried to escape the sound of approaching horses. The wind carried the faint, sharp clatter of hooves and shouts, and she felt her heart pound like a drum in her chest. She knew they were too late. Before she could even understand what was happening, soldiers and settlers surrounded them. The girl's father tried to protect his family, waving his arms and shouting in his native tongue, but the soldiers did not listen. Chaos erupted as people were separated, screaming filled the air, and the smell of smoke and fear mingled with the dry desert air. In the confusion, the girl was grabbed roughly by a soldier. She struggled, twisting in his strong grip, her heart pounding with terror. Her mother called out her name, but before she could reach her, she was pulled away, leaving her family behind. The ride to the settlement was long and harsh. The girl sat on a horse she did not know how to ride, her hands tied with rough rope. Her small body ached from the journey, and every noise made her flinch. Around her, other captives were also quiet and tense, the silence heavy with fear. She had never felt so powerless, and yet, in the corner of her mind, a small spark of determination burned. She refused to give up. She refused to let them see her broken. When they finally reached the settlement, the girl was led to a small, unfamiliar house on the edge of the town. The walls were made of rough wood, and the windows were small, letting in little light. She was pushed inside and told to sit on the floor. Her eyes scanned the room nervously, taking in every detail. There were no familiar shapes, no signs of her people, nothing that reminded her of home. The smell of cooking fires and wood smoke filled the air, but it was different from the fires she knew. It smelled of strange herbs and meats she had never eaten. Her new master, a middle-aged man with a stern face but tired eyes, watched her silently. He spoke to her in English, a language she barely understood, and she could only shake her head. She realized quickly that this man expected obedience, and she knew that disobedience could be dangerous. Yet, even in her fear, she felt a sense of pride and defiance. She would not be treated like an object. She would not be made to feel small. Days passed slowly. The girl was given food, a place to sleep, and the bare necessities, but nothing more. She was not allowed to leave the house, and the ropes that bound her wrists were loosened only occasionally. Each day, she watched the world outside her small window, longing to see the mountains she had once run through freely. She missed her family terribly and cried quietly at night, the tears soaking into the rough fabric of the blanket she had been given. But even in those quiet moments, she told herself she must be strong. Her new master, though harsh at first, was not cruel in every way. He brought her food and water, and sometimes he spoke softly, asking simple questions she did not understand. She watched him closely, learning his habits, his moods, and the small kindnesses he offered. She realized that perhaps not all humans were cruel, even if their actions seemed frightening. Slowly, she began to notice small patterns, when he was angry, when he was calm, and when there might be an opportunity to speak up without punishment. One evening, after a long day of sitting quietly in the small room, the girl gathered her courage. She looked up at the man and in her broken English asked a simple question, "Why me?" Her voice was trembling, but her eyes were steady. The man paused, clearly surprised that she had spoken. He looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and caution. He explained in his own way that she had been taken because of the ongoing conflicts between their people. He spoke slowly, trying to make her understand, though she only caught fragments of his words. The girl listened carefully. She did not fully understand everything, but she realized that she must learn his language to survive. She began to repeat the words he spoke, trying to remember them. At night, she practiced quietly, whispering the sounds over and over until they felt familiar. It was a small victory, a tiny act of resistance against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. With each new word, she felt a small bit of control return to her. Even in captivity, the girl's mind was alive with plans. She thought of her family, of the mountains, of the rivers where she had once played. She imagined running again, free and unafraid. She knew that one day she might find a way back, and that thought gave her strength. She also realized that she must understand her captor, not just to survive, but to protect herself. Knowledge could be a shield as powerful as any weapon. As the days turned into weeks, the girl began to notice changes in herself. Her fear did not disappear, but it became a part of her rather than something that controlled her. She walked taller, spoke when she could, and refused to be silent when it mattered. Her spirit remained unbroken, and even her captor could see the fire in her eyes. There was a tension between them, a quiet struggle for respect and understanding, though neither could yet name it. One afternoon, the girl was cleaning the small room she had been assigned when the man entered. He carried a small bundle of food and set it on the table. She looked up at him and in a voice steadier than she expected said, "I not slave." The words were simple but heavy with meaning. The man stopped, his expression unreadable. For the first time, he seemed to consider her as more than a captive, perhaps even as a person with thoughts and feelings of her own. That moment marked the beginning of a subtle change. The girl had spoken her truth, however timidly, and it had been heard. She did not know what the future held, whether she would ever return to her family, or whether she would ever feel completely free again. But in that instant, she felt a surge of power she had never known before. She was no longer just a victim of circumstances. She was a human being asserting her dignity in a world that sought to take it from her. Night fell, and the desert outside grew quiet. The girl lay on the rough blanket, staring at the small window, listening to the distant calls of the night birds and the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush. She thought of her family, of the life she had known, and of the life she had yet to live. She closed her eyes and made a silent promise to herself. She would survive, she would endure, and one day she would find a way to be free again, not just from the ropes, but from the fear that tried to chain her spirit. In the stillness of that desert night, a young Apache girl, far from home and surrounded by strangers, discovered a truth that would carry her through the darkest days. Courage does not mean the absence of fear. Courage means holding onto hope, asserting one's voice, and refusing to surrender one's dignity, no matter the circumstances. And so, the first chapter of her journey ended not with freedom, but with something equally powerful, a sense of self, a determination that could never be chained, and the quiet, unshakable hope that one day she would reclaim her life. The days in the small wooden house passed. Slowly, yet each one brought new lessons for the young Apache girl. She had learned to understand a few words of English, enough to know when the man was angry, when he was calm, or when he was simply going about his daily routines. Though she remained cautious, she also began to observe him with curiosity. He was not as frightening as she had first thought, but he was complicated, full of rules and habits she could not yet fully understand. Her new master, as she had started calling him in her mind, was a man of routine. Each morning he would rise before dawn, light a fire in the hearth, and go about his work quietly. Sometimes he would speak to the girl, asking her simple questions about her health or her hunger. At first, she only nodded or shook her head, unsure how to respond. But slowly she began to repeat words, practicing the phrases he used. Each day, she grew a little more confident in her ability to communicate, and with each new word, she felt a small piece of control returning to her life. Despite the small kindnesses, the girl never forgot that she was a captive. Her wrists were free most of the time now, but she still felt the weight of fear in the pit of her stomach. She longed for her family, for the open desert and the sounds of her village. She remembered the laughter of her siblings, the smell of cooking fires, and the songs her mother would hum as she worked. Every memory was sharp and painful, reminding her of the life she had lost. Yet, even in the sadness, there was a quiet determination. She would survive, and she would not lose herself in this foreign place. One afternoon, while sweeping the floor, the girl noticed the man watching her more closely than usual. His expression was thoughtful, almost puzzled, as if he were trying to understand her actions. She straightened her back and continued her work, trying to appear calm. In her mind, she reminded herself that every small gesture, every word she spoke, could shape how he saw her. She wanted him to see her as more than a prisoner, as more than a possession. She wanted him to see her as a human being, capable of thought, feeling, and dignity. It was during this time that the girl began to explore small ways to assert herself. One morning, she gathered the courage to speak. "Food, please, more water," she said, her voice trembling slightly. The man looked at her, surprised that she had spoken in full sentences. He nodded and brought her what she asked for. Though it seemed like a small act to the girl, it was monumental. She had made her needs known and had been understood. It gave her a sense of power she had never felt before, a tiny victory in a life where so much had been taken from her. As the girl learned to navigate her new surroundings, she also began to notice the man's own struggles. He was not unkind, but he was rigid, often unsure how to interact with someone from a culture so different from his own. He tried to teach her his language, his ways, and his rules, but he did so without understanding her world, her customs, or her fears. At first, she resisted his lessons, refusing to follow orders that felt unfair or unnecessary. Yet, over time, she realized that learning his ways could be a tool for survival, a way to protect herself while retaining her own identity. The girl also discovered small joys in her daily life. She found a patch of sunlight near the window and would sit there for hours, tracing patterns in the dust with her fingers. She listened to the birds outside, remembering the songs of her homeland. Sometimes she would hum quietly, recalling the melodies her mother had taught her. These moments, though simple, were precious. They reminded her that even in captivity, life could still hold beauty, and even in fear, hope could still bloom. One evening, as the sun dipped low in the sky and painted the room in warm shades of orange and pink, the girl dared to speak more boldly. "I'm not slave," she said, her voice firmer than before. The man froze, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time. He did not respond immediately, and the silence stretched long and tense. But in that silence, something shifted. The girl realized that her words had weight. They had meaning. They had the power to change how she was treated, even in small ways. From that day on, a subtle change occurred in their relationship. The man began to treat her with a cautious respect. He still gave orders, still maintained rules, but he listened more, watched more, and sometimes paused before speaking. The girl, in turn, learned to observe him more closely, noticing his moods, his habits, and his small gestures of kindness. Slowly, an unspoken understanding began to form between them, fragile but real, like a thread being carefully woven between two very different people. Despite this growing understanding, the girl never forgot who she was or where she came from. She kept her memories alive, telling herself stories of her family, her village, and the lands she had known. Each story was a shield, a way to protect her heart from despair. She imagined herself running through the mountains, her hair flying in the wind, free and unafraid. These imagined journeys gave her strength, reminding her that her spirit could never be truly chained, even if her body was confined. The man, too, began to change, though slowly and unconsciously. He watched the girl with growing curiosity and at times admiration. He noticed how she carried herself with dignity, even in the most difficult moments. He saw the fire in her eyes, the courage that refused to be extinguished. And in those observations, he began to reflect on his own actions, his own assumptions, and the nature of justice and compassion. Though he had taken her from her home, he was learning slowly to see her not as property, but as a person with thoughts, feelings, and a will of her own. One day, as the girl sat quietly near the hearth, the man approached with a small book. He placed it on the table and looked at her expectantly. The girl tilted her head, unsure what it was for. The man began to point at the words slowly, carefully, teaching her their sounds and meanings. At first, it was difficult, frustrating even. The letters seemed strange and meaningless, but the girl persisted. She repeated the words aloud, stumbled, corrected herself, and tried again. Each new word was a victory, a step toward understanding, a way to reclaim some control over her life. As the days turned into weeks, the girl's language skills grew. She could now understand simple sentences, follow instructions, and express her basic needs. Communication became a bridge between her world and his, a fragile but vital connection. Through these exchanges, she discovered that her captor was not entirely heartless, that beneath his stern exterior, there was a man capable of thought, reflection, and perhaps even kindness. And in recognizing this, she learned an important lesson. Survival was not just about strength or cunning. It was also about understanding, empathy, and careful negotiation. The girl also began to teach the man in her own way. She shared small pieces of her culture, gestures, and expressions that he had never seen before. Sometimes he was curious, sometimes confused, but always attentive. She showed him that she was not a blank slate to be filled with his ways, but a person with her own history, her own knowledge, and her own identity. Slowly, the balance of power began to shift. The girl's voice grew stronger, her presence more significant, and her spirit more unyielding. Despite the growing connection, the girl never let her guard down completely. She knew the world outside the house was still dangerous, that her freedom could not be taken for granted, and that she must remain vigilant. Yet, even in her caution, there was a growing sense of hope. She realized that survival did not have to mean surrender. She could live, learn, and even influence her circumstances without losing herself. And in that realization, she found a quiet joy, a small but powerful victory in a life that had been filled with uncertainty and fear. By the time the sun set each day, painting the sky with colors of fire and gold, the girl had grown in ways that no one could take from her. She had learned to speak, to understand, and to assert herself. She had discovered the power of her own voice, the strength of her own mind, and the resilience of her spirit. And though the road ahead remained uncertain, she faced it with courage, hope, and an unshakable determination to be more than a captive, to be a person, respected, heard, and free in her own way. And so, life continued in that small house on the edge of the settlement. Each day was a lesson, each moment a challenge, and each interaction a chance to shape the future. The girl was no longer just a frightened captive. She was a survivor, a learner, and a small but growing presence of strength and dignity. Her journey had only just begun, but already she was making her mark on a world that had tried to silence her. The days turned into months, and the small wooden house began to feel both familiar and strange to the young Apache girl. She knew the routines of her new master, and he, in turn, had begun to recognize her strength and intelligence. Yet, despite the growing understanding between them, life remained a delicate balance of caution, observation, and small acts of defiance. The girl had learned that survival required both patience and courage, and she was determined to face each day with her spirit intact. One morning, as the sun rose over the desert, casting long shadows across the floorboards, the girl was asked to help with the chores around the house. She swept the floors, carried water from the small well, and helped prepare simple meals. Though these tasks were tedious, she approached them with care, aware that her actions were being watched. She moved deliberately, showing that she was capable, responsible, and most importantly, human. Her movements were precise, her mind alert, and her heart cautious. She had learned that respect could be earned not only through words, but also through actions. Her new master, a man who had once seen her only as a captive, began to observe her in a different light. He noticed the careful way she performed each task, the determination in her eyes, and the quiet strength in her posture. He began to speak to her more often, asking questions about her past, her family, and her life among the Apache people. The girl answered cautiously, revealing only fragments of her story, but each word was chosen with care. She wanted him to understand her humanity, but she also knew the value of restraint. Trust, she realized, could not be forced. It had to be earned slowly, day by day. One afternoon, as the girl was tending to the small garden outside the house, a sudden gust of wind scattered the dry leaves and dirt. She bent down quickly to gather them, and the man came out to help her. He showed her how to plant seeds in neat rows, how to water them evenly, and how to protect them from the harsh desert sun. At first, she resisted his instructions, preferring her own methods, but gradually she began to see the wisdom in his ways. The garden became a small project they shared, a bridge between their worlds, and a quiet symbol of cooperation and mutual respect. Even as they worked together, the girl remained vigilant. She never forgot that she was far from home, that the world outside the house was dangerous, and that she could not fully rely on anyone. Yet, she also began to recognize moments of kindness and understanding in her captor. When she fell ill with a fever, he tended to her patiently, bringing water, warm blankets, and small portions of food. He did not force her to speak or obey, but simply waited, allowing her time to recover. In those moments, the girl saw a side of him that was human, caring, and capable of empathy. The girl also discovered new ways to assert herself. One evening, as the sun set and painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, she spoke firmly. I help, but I not slave." The man paused, clearly taken aback by the firmness of her voice. For the first time, he seemed to reflect on her words, realizing that she was not merely a captive, but a person with thoughts, feelings, and a will of her own. The girl had spoken her truth, and in doing so, she had shifted the balance of their relationship. She was no longer just a passive observer. She was an active participant in her own life. Over time, small victories like this began to accumulate. The girl learned to negotiate small freedoms, such as choosing her own tasks, deciding when to speak, and expressing her opinions. Each successful negotiation was a triumph, a reaffirmation of her dignity, and a step toward mutual understanding. She also learned to observe her master carefully, noticing his moods, habits, and moments of hesitation. She realized that respect could be reciprocal, that by understanding him, she could influence his actions as much as he influenced hers. Despite these improvements, the girl never lost sight of her heritage. She continued to practice her native language in secret, recalling the songs, stories, and traditions of her people. She hummed softly to herself, remembering the voices of her family and the laughter of her village. These memories were precious, a way to keep her identity alive, even in a world that often seemed determined to erase it. She knew that her spirit could never be taken, and that her connection to her people was a source of strength that no one could break. As the seasons changed, the girl and her master began to experience moments of genuine connection. One chilly morning, they sat together by the fire, sharing silence rather than words. The girl watched the flames dance and felt a sense of calm she had not known since leaving her home. The man, too, seemed quieter, reflective, and more willing to listen. Though their bond was tentative, fragile, and complicated, it was growing, built on small acts of respect, shared work, and the recognition of each other's humanity. One day, a neighbor came to the house, bringing news of the wider world. The girl listened carefully, realizing how much she had been removed from her own people, how isolated she had become, and how far her journey had carried her. Though the news made her heart ache for her family, it also strengthened her resolve. She understood now that survival was not enough. She had to live with dignity, assert her voice, and find ways to influence her circumstances. Each day was an opportunity to learn, grow, and protect herself, and she approached it with determination. The girl also began to see changes in her master. He was less rigid, more patient, and more willing to consider her perspective. He asked questions about her traditions, her family, and the life she had known. Though his understanding was limited, he listened, and that act alone was meaningful. For the girl, it was proof that even in a world filled with hardship, respect and empathy could grow. She began to trust him cautiously, realizing that survival sometimes required building alliances, even in unexpected places. Despite the growing respect between them, tensions remained. The girl had moments of fear, frustration, and anger, especially when she remembered her family or longed for the freedom of the desert. She resisted the temptation to lash out, instead channeling her emotions into quiet acts of defiance and careful negotiation. She spoke firmly when necessary, performed her tasks with pride, and maintained her dignity in the face of challenges. Each act reinforced her identity and reminded her that she was not powerless, even in captivity. As the days passed, the girl's resilience became evident not only to her master but also to herself. She discovered that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. She learned that respect could be earned through patience, understanding, and careful communication. And she realized that even in a situation where she had little control, she could shape her life in meaningful ways. Her spirit, once threatened by fear and uncertainty, now burned brighter, stronger, and more determined than ever. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the desert, the girl sat by the window, reflecting on her journey. She remembered the chaos of her capture, the terror of the long ride, and the loneliness of the first nights in the wooden house. Yet she also remembered the small victories, the lessons learned, and the moments of connection that had begun to form between her and her master. She understood now that life was complex, that people could be both kind and stern, and that survival required wisdom, patience, and courage. In that quiet moment, the girl made a promise to herself. She would continue to learn, to observe, and to assert herself. She would hold on to her heritage, her language, and her memories, and she would never allow fear or circumstance to diminish her spirit. She knew that the journey ahead would be difficult, filled with challenges, tests, and moments of doubt. Yet she also knew that she was capable, strong, and resilient. She would face whatever came with dignity, courage, and determination. And so, life continued in the small wooden house. Each day was a test, each interaction a lesson, and each moment an opportunity to grow. The girl was no longer a frightened captive. She was a survivor, a learner, and a quiet force of strength and dignity. Her journey was far from over, but already she had discovered the power of her own voice, the resilience of her spirit, and the possibility of respect, understanding, and connection in even the most challenging circumstances. The days continued to flow slowly in the small wooden house, yet something had shifted between the young Apache girl and her master. What had begun as fear and mistrust was slowly giving way to a cautious connection, built on small acts of understanding and quiet respect. The girl had learned to navigate the rhythms of the household, and the man, in turn, had begun to recognize her intelligence, courage, and dignity. There was still tension, still uncertainty, but now there was also a fragile sense of possibility. One morning, as the sun rose and painted the desert in soft gold, the girl helped her master with the chores outside. She carried water from the well, swept the floor of the porch, and tended the small garden they had planted together. The work was repetitive, but it had become a rhythm, a shared experience that bound them in unexpected ways. The girl noticed small details in her master's movements, the way he paused to watch the wind move the dust, the careful way he handled the tools, and the quiet concentration in his eyes. These observations gave her insight into his character and helped her anticipate his needs and moods. The master, too, was learning. He watched the girl with growing curiosity, realizing that she was far more than a frightened captive. He began to ask her questions, not out of duty or obligation, but out of genuine interest. "What do you eat at home?" he asked one day, gesturing toward the simple meal they shared. The girl hesitated, unsure if she should speak, but then she described the foods of her village, the roasted corn, the sweet berries, and the stews her mother had made. She spoke slowly, carefully choosing words in her broken English. Her master listened intently, nodding as he tried to understand her world. In these exchanges, a subtle bond began to form. The girl realized that sharing her stories, her traditions, and her memories did not make her weaker. It made her human in the eyes of her captor. She could speak and he would listen. She could teach and he would learn. This realization filled her with a quiet confidence. For the first time since her capture, she felt that she could influence the world around her, even in small ways. As the days passed, the girl's courage grew. She began to express her opinions more clearly, gently correcting mistakes, suggesting ways to improve tasks, and asking questions about the world outside the house. Each time she spoke, she tested the boundaries of her freedom and learned how far she could go without angering her master. He, in turn, began to respect her voice, recognizing that her thoughts and ideas were valuable. Their interactions became a delicate dance of negotiation, understanding, and mutual recognition. One chilly afternoon, the girl found herself sitting by the fire while her master worked quietly nearby. She watched the flames flicker and listened to the crackle of the wood. A feeling of calm washed over her, and she realized that she no longer felt entirely alone. Though her family was far away and her home had been taken from her, she had carved out a small space of safety and connection. She could breathe, think, and speak, small freedoms but precious ones. Encouraged by this sense of calm, the girl began to open her heart in subtle ways. She shared memories of her village, the songs her mother sang, the dances during celebrations, the stories her elders told by the fire. Her master listened, sometimes asking questions, sometimes simply watching and learning. He began to understand that this girl carried a rich culture, full of wisdom and beauty, and that her identity was not something to be erased or controlled. Respect for her heritage became a bridge between them, a way to deepen their fragile connection. The girl also began to notice the man's softer side. He would pause during chores to watch the birds, admire the sunset, or speak quietly to himself about tasks that needed completing. She realized that he, too, was human, complex, thoughtful, and capable of kindness. These observations gave her hope. Perhaps, she thought, it was possible for people from different worlds to find common ground, to respect and even care for each other despite past conflicts and misunderstandings. One evening, as twilight settled over the desert, the girl dared to take a small risk. She spoke to her master in her quiet, steady voice. I want to help, not just obey." The man looked at her, surprised by the confidence in her words. For a moment, neither spoke. Then he nodded slowly, a small acknowledgement of her growing independence. The girl felt a surge of pride. She had expressed her desire to contribute meaningfully, to be seen as a partner in life rather than a passive observer. And in that moment, a new level of trust began to emerge between them. From that day on, their routines took on new meaning. The girl was allowed to make small decisions about the household, the garden, and the work they shared. She began to learn new skills, from cooking to tending animals, and her master guided her patiently, offering advice without imposing authority. Each success, Each lesson learned strengthened their connection. They were no longer just master and captive. They were collaborators, cautiously building a bond of respect and understanding. Yet, the girl never lost sight of her own identity. She continued to practice her native language, hum her mother's songs, and recall the stories of her people. She shared these moments with her master selectively, choosing when and how to reveal them. In doing so, she maintained her heritage and ensured that her culture remained alive within her, even as she adapted to her new surroundings. She understood that her strength lay in balancing both worlds, learning from the man without losing herself. The master, too, began to change. He listened more, judged less, and made an effort to understand her perspective. He saw that her courage and intelligence were not threats, but gifts that could enrich their lives together. He began to reflect on his own assumptions, realizing that respect and empathy were not weaknesses, but signs of wisdom. And slowly, a mutual recognition took root. Each saw the humanity in the other, and each began to act with care and thoughtfulness. One day, as they worked together in the garden, the girl looked up at the man and asked, "Can we learn together?" Her words were hesitant but filled with hope. The man smiled faintly, a rare expression of warmth. He nodded, and from that moment, a new chapter began. They shared knowledge, skills, and stories. She taught him about her people, and he taught her about his world. Each exchange was a small act of connection, bridging the gap between cultures and experiences. Evenings became times of reflection and conversation. The girl and her master would sit by the fire, speaking in simple words, sharing thoughts and learning from each other. She discovered that communication could be more than survival. It could be a way to build trust, foster understanding, and create a shared sense of purpose. She realized that even in a life that had begun with fear and captivity, it was possible to experience care, respect, and mutual support. As the seasons changed, the girl grew stronger, more confident, and more assured in her identity. She no longer saw herself solely as a captive, but as a person capable of influencing her life and the lives of those around her. She embraced small freedoms, sought opportunities for learning, and nurtured the fragile connection that had grown between her and the man. She understood that life was complicated, but she also understood that courage, dignity, and empathy could guide her through even the most challenging circumstances. One quiet night, as the desert wind whispered through the sagebrush, the girl reflected on her journey. She had faced fear, loss, and uncertainty, yet she had found ways to survive, assert herself, and grow. She had learned to speak, to teach, to observe, and to connect. And in those moments of reflection, she realized that the bond she shared with her master, delicate, tentative, and evolving, was a testament to her strength, wisdom, and resilience. Though she still longed for her family and the home she had lost, she also recognized the possibilities that lay before her. She had discovered that even in captivity, she could shape her world, influence others, and maintain her dignity. She had learned that respect was earned through courage and understanding, and that connection could grow even in the most unlikely circumstances. And with that understanding, she felt a quiet hope, a sense of purpose, and the unshakable belief that her journey was far from over, but that she was ready to face whatever came next with strength, intelligence, and heart. The days in the small wooden house had grown warmer with the arrival of spring. The desert had begun to bloom with small patches of green and bright flowers, and the young Apache girl felt a quiet sense of hope stirring in her heart. She had learned so much since the day she was first brought to the settlement, about survival, about courage, and about the strange, complicated bond she had formed with her master. Now she felt ready to take the next step in her journey, one that would test her strength, wisdom, and heart. By now, the girl had grown confident in her abilities. She helped manage the household chores, tended the garden, and cared for the small animals near the house. She had learned to speak English well enough to communicate clearly, and she used her words carefully, always aware of their power. She no longer viewed her master solely as a captor. She recognized him as a man shaped by his own experiences, capable of kindness, patience, and reflection. And while she had respect for him, she also understood that her life, her choices, and her identity were hers alone. One morning she approached him as he was chopping wood near the back of the house. She spoke with quiet determination. "I want to live with respect, not fear," she said, her voice steady. The man paused, leaning on his axe, and looked at her carefully. For the first time he seemed to truly see her, not as a captive, not as a responsibility, but as a human being with her own mind, her own feelings, and her own will. He nodded slowly, a silent acknowledgement of her courage and clarity. In that moment, something shifted between them. The girl began to assert herself more openly. She chose what work she wanted to do each day, and she offered suggestions for how the household could be managed. She taught her master about the plants in the desert, about the animals she had seen, and about the ways her people lived in harmony with the land. Her master listened, learning not just the facts she shared, but the wisdom and perspective behind them. He began to see that her knowledge was valuable and that her voice deserved respect. At the same time, the girl continued to honor her own traditions. She practiced her language, sang the songs her mother had taught her, and recalled the stories of her people. She shared these moments with her master when she felt it was safe, allowing him to glimpse the rich culture she carried within her. In doing so, she maintained her identity, asserting that her heritage was not something to be erased or forgotten. Her courage, wisdom, and self-respect became a guiding light, not just for herself, but for the man who had once seen her only as a captive. One afternoon, as the sun set in a golden haze, the girl and her master sat together by the small fire outside. She spoke softly, recounting the stories of her childhood, tales of brave warriors, clever elders, and joyful celebrations. He listened in silence, occasionally asking questions to understand more. In that quiet space, the girl realized that their relationship had changed completely. They were no longer captor and captive, but teacher and learner, observer and witness, human beings connected through shared respect and understanding. The girl also began to take initiative in practical ways. She organized the household chores, planned the meals, and cared for the animals with thought and efficiency. Her master relied on her skills and wisdom, and he began to treat her as a partner rather than a subordinate. When disagreements arose, they were resolved through calm discussion rather than fear or authority. The girl had discovered that influence did not come from force, but from intelligence, courage, and the ability to communicate with clarity and respect. Despite her growing confidence, the girl never forgot the longing in her heart for her family and her homeland. She spoke often of the mountains, the rivers, and the people she had left behind. Her master listened patiently, and though he could not return her to them, he understood the importance of these memories. He encouraged her to tell her stories, to keep her traditions alive, and to honor the life she had known. In doing so, he showed her that respect and care could take many forms. Not all were tied to freedom of movement, but many were tied to the acknowledgement of the human spirit. As weeks turned into months, the girl found a sense of balance. She could navigate the world of her master while remaining true to her own identity. She had learned to communicate, negotiate, and influence with wisdom. She had discovered the power of her voice, the strength of her spirit, and the value of dignity. And she had learned that courage was not merely surviving, but shaping her life with intention, even within the limits imposed upon her. One day she spoke to her master again, her voice calm but firm. "I choose respect and partnership, not fear, not chains." The man looked at her, seeing the determination, wisdom, and bravery in her eyes. He realized that he had never truly had the right to claim authority over her spirit, and that the respect she demanded was not only reasonable, but necessary. In that moment, He acknowledged her fully as a person with her own choices, her own life, and her own destiny. From then on, their relationship transformed completely. The girl worked with freedom within the household, making choices, contributing ideas, and exercising her skills. She continued to share her culture and her knowledge, teaching her master and strengthening the bridge between their worlds. The man, in turn, became a protector and ally rather than a captor. He guided her, supported her, and respected her autonomy. Their bond, once defined by fear and obligation, had grown into one of mutual respect, understanding, and even quiet friendship. The girl also began to dream of the future. She imagined returning to her family, reconnecting with her people, and sharing the lessons she had learned. She thought of ways to maintain her dignity, to preserve her culture, and to help others navigate difficult circumstances with courage and wisdom. These dreams gave her a sense of purpose, reminding her that life was not merely about survival, but about growth, learning, and the meaningful exercise of freedom and choice. Even in the quiet moments, she continued to assert herself. She spoke up when she disagreed, offered advice when it was needed, and maintained her independence in thought and action. She had discovered that freedom was not always about physical movement. It was about the ability to think, speak, and live with dignity. And in that realization, she found a deep sense of empowerment, one that could never be taken away. As the desert wind whispered through the sagebrush outside the house, the girl reflected on the journey she had taken. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and loss, yet she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. She had learned to navigate a complex world, to assert her voice, and to maintain her identity. She had built a bridge of respect and understanding with her master, transforming their relationship and in many ways reshaping her own life. The girl realized that the true measure of her journey was not in the hardships she had endured, but in the strength, wisdom, and dignity she had cultivated along the way. She understood that life was complex, that people could change, and that courage was not the absence of fear, but the ability to act with intention and honor. And in that understanding, she found a sense of peace, hope, and readiness for whatever lay ahead. As the sun set and the sky glowed with deep reds and purples, the girl felt a quiet triumph. She had survived captivity, navigated cultural divides, and asserted her independence. She had maintained her dignity, preserved her heritage, and forged a bond built on mutual respect. And though the road ahead was still uncertain, she faced it with courage, wisdom, and an unshakable belief in her own strength. In the stillness of that evening, the girl understood something profound. Freedom was not only a place or a situation, it was a state of mind, a choice, and a way of being. She had discovered that she could live with respect, assert her voice, and influence the world around her, even in circumstances that once seemed impossible. And with that understanding, she felt truly alive, ready to face the future with courage, hope, and heart. And so, the story of the young Apache girl concluded not with despair or defeat, but with empowerment, dignity, and the quiet strength of a spirit that refused to be broken. She had claimed her voice, her identity, and her life, and in doing so, she became a symbol of resilience, courage, and hope for all who would hear her story.